Well, first let me say that was really a terrific presentation, and hearing your your description of that event in Fallujah. I wish we could train not just our SEALs and our Marines, but our police and our citizens in a little bit of that kind of thinking, because if you look at what's going on in the world now, there's all too much immediately reaching to fight or do something that's aggressive, and it merely exacerbates the situation. So I think it's a great life lesson. I want to say, first of all, it's been a terrific session to participate in, but to sit through too. And a lot of credit goes around, and I want to may miss a few people, but I first want to recognize Jim Flagging, who runs our office out here, but really was the Uber organizer. Casey Aquez was very, very much involved in putting the program together. I also want to thank Emily Fortis, Hal Libby, Spencer Davis, Paul Doherty, and Donna Artusi, who just, I guess it's her second week here, all of whom contributed a great deal to making this system run, this conference run very smoothly. Also, our moderators, Reggie Brothers, Jason Cook, Mark Weatherford, delighted to have them participating and sharing their wisdom. And again, I want to thank all of you for coming and those who worked hard to make this happen. The very fact that it seemed to be effortless is a sign of how much effort went into it. So with that, let me give you a call to action. And that seemed like a kind of maybe overly ambitious description of what I'm going to talk about. But I'm going to try to stand back and talk about some of the things we've learned during the course of this day and some of the messages we might take back to our institutions and our enterprises and even our families as we leave this event. I think anybody who reads the newspapers knows we are living at a time when literally every day and every week we're seeing new examples of the kind of challenges we face in terms of cybersecurity. And I want to pause for a second and go a little off script to indicate it's not just cybersecurity. I know from a lot of the work that we do that increasingly people worry about their physical security. And whether it's Barcelona or Charlottesville, we're at the point now that when you walk down the street, you really look around at the automobiles and you wonder, is someone going to decide they just want to just take me out? I'm not saying that in order to suggest you fight or flee. I'm suggesting that we're really entering a period where mindfulness and thinking through what you're going to do in a security situation, whether it's physical or cyber, really is the key premise of your own personal security. And I can tell you from my time at the Department of Homeland Security, one of the lessons I learned through a lot of different experiences is planning, thinking through, training, exercising. All of these things prepare you to deal with the things which are unexpected. And those are often the things that come to bite you. So we're in a world right now where IT and cyber is really at the heart of almost everything that we do. Obviously, we have a lot of sensitive data that we put online or is put online for us. Our business operations often depend upon cyber to operate. Customer interface, ability to do transactions, ability to order goods and services, all of that is now really more and more online. Financial transactions for the financial system is now, whether you think that in the future it's all going to be about blockchain or distributed ledgers, the fact of the matter is it's all going to occur electronically. And that system doesn't work if we don't have cybersecurity. The lights, the cameras, the food that was cooked, all of that depends on control systems. And increasingly those control systems are again being managed and controlled based on the internet and based on what's online. And all of this expands what I call the surface area for vulnerability. Places that a bad actor might detect something that they want to attack, penetrate, or disable. And that means something we need to worry about because the effects can be a ripple effect across almost everything that we do. This is even getting more complicated. As a number of our speakers talked about, we are now in the world of bring your own device to work. You don't want to just get the desktop or the laptop that your employer gave you. You want to be able to take your own phone and your own laptop and your own tablet in and connect it up. And that means you've got a lot of unvetted or potentially unvetted endpoints entering your network. We're worrying more about subs. We depend upon subs to provide the hardware and the software that we're using. We may depend upon them to actually be producing something in the chain of production. If there is a failure for them, it's a problem for us. If your target and your plumber wants to hook into your HVAC system and the plumber doesn't have a secure network, you're going to wind up picking up that infection. The supply chain, everything that is actually incorporated physically or virtually in what we do, is also something we need to worry about. And finally, the so-called Internet of Things, where more and more things are smart, meaning that they are often designed without any thought of security, but simply in a way that allows them to connect up to the network, and thereby, if they've got a problem, it becomes a problem of the network. So this surface area is ever expanding, it's not going to contract, and this is a challenge for all of us. Much as we see greater vulnerabilities across the entire network and network of networks, we see more threat actors. Obviously, we've lived with financial fraud and identity theft for many, many years. But the scale of the theft of data has now really dramatically expanded. Yahoo lost 1 billion user accounts. 2 hacks, each of which took 500 million accounts. One of them, according to charges from the US Department of Justice, actually involved the engagement of 2 Russian intelligence officials who were part of collecting that data. And while there may have been a monetary motive here, there may have been another motive as well. We have straight-out bank robbery, but on a huge scale. You remember the Bank of Bangladesh account at Federal Reserve of New York, $81 million was removed electronically by people who had stolen the credentials of the Bank of Bangladesh and were using it to move money to various institutions in the Philippines. Now, they actually planned to move $1 billion. Luckily for the Federal Reserve, there was a clerk, I think in Sri Lanka, who was looking at the instructions and saw spelling errors and thought, well, there's something funny about this, and blew the whistle. Other than that, it would have been $1 billion out the door. We've seen business operations crippled and damaged. You heard some of the examples a little bit earlier because of WannaCry, Petya, and not Petya. And that affected everything from healthcare systems to Maersk, the shipping line, an automobile plant in Japan was shut down, railroad in Germany was shut down. All of that based on this malware that literally went around the globe. In terms of deliberate attacks, in 2015 and 2016 in the Ukraine, Christmas time, the lights went out for hundreds of thousands of people because the substation and the electronics that ran that control system was attacked, probably by the Russians, as a way of sending a message to the Ukrainians. And that is probably just a harbinger of more of what we're going to see to come. And finally, as we've talked a lot about over the last few months, our elections have been the subject of hacking. We've seen efforts to penetrate voter registration databases in Illinois, in other parts of the country. While I'm not of the mind that this actually affected the outcome of the election, it's a very, very clear warning that somebody could, at a minimum, disrupt an election, if not actually impact it. So the nature of the attacks is now dramatically expanding, and the scale of the attacks is expanding. And here's the really, I think, new development. More and more, we're beginning to see nation states involved tacitly or specifically driving these kinds of attacks. WannaCry has now been attributed by a number of intelligence agencies to the North Koreans, who don't participate in our global economic system, so they're simply interested in stealing money in order to support themselves. As I mentioned earlier, the attack on Yahoo involved Russian intelligence agents, and we've seen attacks on the Ukraine, which in my view come from at least surrogates, if not actual agents of Russia. We also saw, for example, the theft of 25,000 plus personnel files from the Office of Personnel Management. And again, a lot of the reporting and assumption has been that that's a nation state collecting this for counterintelligence purposes. And I know many people in this room, myself included, were victims of that attack. So we're now thinking about nation state actors who are more sophisticated and whose motivations may not be as easy to anticipate as criminals. It may also be the case that their activities change depending on the geopolitical situation. So what do we do as we manage enterprises in trying to deal with a security environment and a risk environment that is increasing as the surface area of attack and as to the nature and the number of threat actors and the scale of what they're able to do. Well, as I think I said earlier, if I get up here and tell you there's a way to stop all this stuff from happening, time to check me into the hospital. That is not realistic. This is about risk management. The example I like to use when I talk about this is the human body. I think the human body is the most perfectly designed, but not perfect, defense mechanism there exists on Earth. And the way it works is this. A lot of malicious things, bacteria, viruses, other kinds of impurities are kept out of your body by your skin, by your membranes, by the way you're designed to kind of slough a lot of it off. But the body is not designed on the assumption that nothing gets in. So various kinds of bacteria and viruses and other foreign matter are constantly entering our body, some of which we put in deliberately, some of which just comes from being in the environment. And so what our body does is it builds resiliency. You have white blood cells, and what they do is they characterize the intruder. If it's not a problem, great. It may even be benign. But if it is a problem, they will kill it. And we actually have a form of information sharing called immunization. When you get vaccinated, basically what's happening is the NIH or whoever has come up with the code for this season's flu virus. They're sharing the code with your white blood cells, and that empowers them to defeat the flu when it arises. Here's the important thing. Nobody goes to the doctor and says, "Doctor, I don't ever want to get sick." In fact, those few people who, for whatever strange reason, grew up in a sterile environment, like, for example, people who grew up in a bubble because of an immune issue, those people are the most at risk because they've never been exposed to the hazards that are out there and they've never built up the antibodies. So what I'm saying is when you talk about risk management, you actually want to be fully engaged with the fact that some of these risks will come to pass. But you want to have a system of resilience, detection, and ability to remedy that minimizes the damage, learns from the mistakes, repairs itself, and is able to recover and be healthier. And that is the model I like to transmit to people when I talk to them about cybersecurity. So when we talk about the risk, generally there are kind of three categories of data that we look at. Who are the threat actors? And I've talked a little bit about that. What are the high consequence events that a threat could cause? Some things are fairly trivial, and if it happens, you don't really worry about it. Some things are cataclysmic. And then finally, what are our vulnerabilities and how do we reduce them? And of those three elements, really vulnerability is almost the only thing you can really affect. The threat actors are out there. You can be aware of them. You can hope that law enforcement or the government removes some of them. But the reality is you in running your enterprise are not going to be able to do much about that. In terms of high consequence, as we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, you do need to know and understand exactly what the full range of consequences are that you might suffer if there's a serious and unmitigated attack. But again, it's unlikely you're going to be able to affect the consequences that much, although you can mitigate it through various kinds of resiliency. But probably what you're going to be most able to affect and focus on is vulnerabilities. And that's, I think, where I'd like to start the discussion. I have what I think when I spoke at Black Hat, I called 10 commandments of cybersecurity, 10 different things you need to think about. This is probably not going to be news to most of you here, but what I've tried to do is think about it in a systematic way. And I begin with the perimeter. Somebody from a well-known company here in the Valley, which I will not identify for obvious reasons, was the subject of a hack. And then afterwards, I was in a discussion with that person about what had happened. And they said, well, we had the M&M theory of security. So I said, what's that? That's a hard shell outside and a soft center. And basically, that's a great recipe for somebody. If they get past the hard shell, they're eating all your chocolate up. So that perimeter mentality, it still surprises me to learn, is still what a lot of people have in their head. To use the example that I think somebody used earlier with the border wall, having spent time actually personally building the border wall, let me tell you, if you think that a border wall is going to keep out bad people, it's about as effective as the M&M theory of cybersecurity. The wall can help, but it's everything you do inside the perimeter that makes a huge difference in terms of the system. And that's true here as well. But I still do want to say the first commandment is you've got to at least know what your perimeter is. You've got to survey your endpoints. You've got to know who's allowed to hook in, whether it be a subcontractor or a service provider. And you've got to be aware of what needs to constantly be updated to keep the perimeter as strong as possible, because it is your first line of defense. But as I also said, let's look at the chocolate center. Once you've assessed what your critical assets are and what would be the really high consequence injuries, you've got to organize and architect your internal system to segment them, to keep them separate. And again, a great analogy is if you get on a naval vessel or a Coast Guard cutter, what you're going to see is it's compartmented. And if they're watertight compartments, if there's a breach of the hull, you shut that off and you can save the rest of the cutter or the rest of the ship. You've got to have some ability to manage within the architecture of your own structure and your own IT, so that if something is penetrated, it doesn't necessarily infect everything. And that requires understanding that you're not just talking about the data that you're trying to protect. You're also talking about the things that would enable somebody to do things in your system that would weaken it. Administrator privileges, credentials that could be stolen to give access to things that normally would be shut off. So you've got to think about both things that are valuable from a security standpoint intrinsically, as well as the data, which is the core of your business. Now, once you've segmented, okay, now what? How do you decide who gets into what compartment and who doesn't? And that's all about ID and access control, and we've talked a little bit about that today. The key in building trust, and really when you come down to it, security is all about trust, is being able to know who you're dealing with and what are their privileges, when do they get access, what are they allowed to do once they get into a part of the network. And all of that has to be thought through as a matter of policy. Now, one of the things I think everybody here knows is, for too long we have relied upon the password as the identification tool that gives you access. And passwords are inherently weak, because for a password to work, somebody else has to have the password to validate you. The more people who have the password, the more likelihood it may get out. And people are not great, by the way, at remembering their passwords or changing their passwords or coming up with complicated passwords. So that's why we need to be moving really almost entirely to dual authentication, where we use multiple ways of authenticating and different modalities. It may be something that you know, but it may also be something that you have, like a biometric, or something that you carry, like a token, or some combination of those. And while, again, this isn't perfect, it's a question of managing the risk and reducing the risk that somebody is going to wind up being able to impersonate with identity. You also, as you think about identity, ask yourself, why does everybody who has access to a network have the right to do whatever they want on it? I do practice law in my spare time, and one of the things I will tell you is lawyers are terrible about this. Every lawyer believes they ought to be able to do whatever they want on the network. Why can't I put my device on, sit in Starbucks, use open Wi-Fi, and then have administrative privileges to change all the security? And you have to say, you can't do that. As you think about identity, you're thinking about what does somebody need to be able to do, what kinds of administrative privileges they need to have, when are they allowed to download. In some institutions, you now have basically like a dual key authority. You cannot download something or transfer it without having two separate people agree that that's appropriate. It's like with the nuclear codes. So all of these issues are part of building a secure interior architecture. So now you've built your architecture, you've got your perimeter. Now what? Well, it doesn't sit there and take care of itself. And this is where you come to the next commandment, continuous diagnosis and monitoring. You've got to be watching all the time to see, well, what is going on? Are things going on that are anomalous? Are there things that are not working properly? Are we beginning to see a pattern of attacks that suggest we've got a weakness? Only through that can you be aware of something that you need to address and mitigate. And that means, among other things, you've always got to be asking yourself, are there updates or patches that I need to be implementing? And sometimes, frankly, recognizing that can cause some downtime, you've got to make decisions about when you're going to do that, balancing convenience against security. One of the sad things about WannaCry is it was based in part on a vulnerability in Microsoft software. They had actually put a patch out a month before the attack. Those who patched didn't have a problem. Those who didn't patch wound up being vulnerable to that particular exploit. So part of this continuous diagnosis and monitoring, like going to the doctor and being hooked up to an EKG, is making sure you're testing all that internal architecture you have built. Fifth commandment, encryption. If you protect the perimeter and you protect the segments and compartments in your network, you can go a step further. You can protect the data elements themselves. And through encryption and digital rights management, you can put yourself in a position where if somebody actually gets the data, they can't do anything with it. That is something which is now becoming more ubiquitous. I know there's controversy about it from a law enforcement standpoint, but to my mind, this is a foundational element of how we secure the critical data in our networks, even as we move from the perimeter all the way into the individual data elements. Sixth commandment. The problem is most often not who's coming in from outside, but who's coming from inside. And that means insider threats. First, we begin with malicious insiders. Edward Snowden, Exhibit A, a guy who, according to a book that recently came out, not only used his own credentials that gave him access to NSA classified material, but managed to trick other people into borrowing their credentials so he could steal things that only they were able to have access to. A malicious insider can do a huge amount of damage. And related to that, which is the seventh commandment, is the unwitting or unmalicious person who winds up causing damage because they're simply not properly trained and they haven't been exercised and they don't really understand what to do. So here we're dealing not so much with a technology issue as we're dealing with a people issue. When it comes to the deliberate insider, but also to some extent the innocent insider, a lot of what we're now seeing is behavioral analysis. The ability to use data analysis and various kinds of algorithms to see whether there is behavior in the network that ought to alert you to something. This began as rule-based algorithms. You know, you had a certain rule that between this hour and that hour you couldn't move something from your, let's say from your desktop down to a thumb drive. But actually what we have now is something more sophisticated. It looks at people's normal behavior and then looks to see where there are deviations from that behavior. And then it may correlate with things like your physical security. Is somebody in the place that they should normally be when they perform that function? This kind of behavioral analytics is a critical tool, first of all, because it allows you to find the malicious insider, but also if somebody innocently introduced something, so it didn't breach a firewall or it didn't come and bypass antivirus, but it was invited in through negligence, you still get the opportunity to see whether there is something moving around the network that's anomalous, even if there's nothing that automatically raises a red flag. Commandment number 8, backup. We've seen with the ransomware cases that the real problem is for those people who can't get access to the data anymore and they have no other place to go. They have no duplication. That's particularly worrisome in the healthcare system where you're relying upon that data to give patient care. So the obvious key is to back up, but not just back up and keep it in the same network, back up and have it gapped so that once something is in the network with ransomware, it's going to infect your entire network. Getting it in a place or to a place, it might be the cloud, it might be simply be a separate server or separate location in your own enterprise, gives you the ability to really finally have redundancy. And redundancy is one of the key elements of securing yourself against any kind of a disaster, whether it be a physical disaster or a cyber disaster. Ninth commandment is always ask yourself whether you can do more to secure your network by design of the entire network itself. Or another way to look at it is this way. Do you know and have you inventoried and tested all the different kinds of hardware and software on it? And are there things you could do without, or you could modify, or you could upgrade in order to have a more seamless way of operating your security and operating within your network? And do you have secure configuration of all the devices that are on your network? And do you have a way of preventing people from putting insecure devices on your network? At a fundamental level, it asks this question sometimes. Does this need to be connected? Like, do I really have to have my refrigerator connected to the internet? You know, I can kind of tell if I need milk. So if I keep it disconnected, I don't have to worry about somebody entering into my network through my refrigerator. I don't have a high degree of confidence that most of the manufacturers of these smart devices are designing security from the outset. So to be honest, one of the things I would say is ask yourself, do I really need this? And does it really need to be connected or smart? And finally, the 10th commandment, and I would say it's the most important one, is what's your response plan? You find something, how do you mitigate it? How do you deal with it? One of the things those of you who study this know is it's not an all or nothing proposition with an attack. A lot of people think, oh, I was hacked, game over, I'm done, I surrender. But actually, there's a kind of a pathway that is followed by the attackers. First, they probe to find the weakness, then they enter, then they engage in reconnaissance in the network. They may plant certain things. They're going to try to steal administrators' credentials, and all this takes place over a period of time. If somebody is dwelling in your network for 2 hours, that is a very different scenario than if they're there for 2 months or for 8 months. So reduction of the dwell time, mitigation, ability to restore service quickly, being able to separate out those areas that are seriously infected from those that are not in a reactive mode, having a plan and exercising it is really, really a critical part, and I'd say maybe the most important of the 10 commandments. And to give you an example, let's say you're a financial institution, and you're concerned about a theft of credentials of people who bank with you, and now you're not sure when you get instructions about whether to transfer money, whether you can trust those or not. So one thing you could do is you could shut down and say, well, until we've verified or we've reissued credentials, we're not doing any transactions. That's a great way to see all your customers go to the bank across the street. But one thing you could do if you thought about it in advance is this: you could say, okay, if in fact I had a question about credentials, are there other things I know about my customers that would allow me at least to take a certain category of customer and say, I can validate your transactions because of other features of what you do. For example, you've got a periodic, regular set of transactions where you do payroll, and it always goes to the same accounts, and it's always done at the same time every week, week in and week out. If you were to get an instruction next week to do that, you might say, you know what? This is a pattern that we understand. It's a regular pattern. It makes sense. We're going to honor that even though we can't at this point be 100% confident in the credential. If you have, at the other side, a transaction that in scale or in payee is dramatically different, that's a heads up, you don't want to do it. Simply thinking through those problems, then building some of the capabilities to be able to actually expand your alternative ways of validating transactions gives you the tools you need to be resilient when you do have an attack, and that's a huge part of remediation and recovery. So let me step back, having given you the 10 commandments, and talk a little bit about 2 other things. One is we obviously the whole theme of this discussion has been boards and what are the role of boards. And as I think I said earlier, to me, a lot of what we've got to do with board members is empower them, not so inundate them with threats and different kinds of solutions that they simply throw their hands up and say, well, we could bankrupt ourselves, or we don't know what we're going to do, so let's just pray that somebody else gets hit and not us. What you've got to do is manage their expectations, as I've said, come up with some clear, understandable, not technical, although they're technically rooted, strategies for dealing with the threat, as in the 10 commandments I've laid out here, and then give them the ability to get measuring of how you're doing, and to hold people accountable, but also to empower those people to carry out what they have to do. And when I talk about measuring, on some of the boards I'm on, we get a report about number of probes that have been discovered, number of penetrations. We get an analysis of changes in the patterns that we're seeing of attacks. One thing I always say to people, though, is be careful. Lack of detection of something doesn't mean lack of something. And you always have to ask the question, are we seeing less of a certain kind of an attack, or are we just getting it less and getting less data about it? But those kinds of questions, which I don't think are technical, I do think put a board in a position to empower management, to check on management, but not necessarily to try to do the job that management does. So what are 3 things that I think are coming up that I'd keep my eye on? Well, I talked a little bit about the Internet of Things. This is proceeding well ahead of any security effort that's being put into it. And I was at the Munich Security Conference in February of this year, and they do a thing on cyberspace. And the Internet of Things came up, and people started to say, you know, how do we validate that when we buy one of these things that turn your lights on, or you have your Nest for your thermostat, how do we validate that there's security? Do we know if there's a password? Can we change the password? Is there a capability to update if there's a patch? The vast majority of people who get this stuff have no idea about this. The truth is, if the Internet of Things is going to require every consumer to do their own scrub to make sure that the product is secure, it is going to fail as a business enterprise. What we need to do is to figure out a way to validate the basic security features of these things in a way that the public can rely upon. And a great example is your grocery store. For the vast majority of people, you don't think twice when you go into your Giant or your Safeway or whatever you have out here to buy your groceries. You assume, because we have an FDA and a regulatory system and a set of standards for food production and handling, you assume that the vast probability is that whatever you get will be untainted, healthy to eat, and something you can enjoy. You can't do that with wired electronics at this point. But if we could, that would actually, to my mind, be an enabler of that as a developing part of our economy. It's a little bit counterintuitive to be essentially arguing for regulation, but I'm going to tell you from a business standpoint, regulation and standardization properly applied is a good thing, because what it does is it eliminates the transaction costs of the consumer having to figure out whether something is safe, and for the most part, deciding maybe they're not going to buy it because they can't be sure. So I think that's something we're going to need to think a little bit about as we talk about cybersecurity going forward. Second big area, which I've alluded to, is artificial intelligence or machine learning. We are generating huge amounts of data, and it's way beyond what any human being or team of humans can analyze. It's useless if we can't have machine learning that enables us to assimilate it, understand what the patterns are, learn as new things happen, update itself and the algorithm as we add additional data, and that suddenly allows us to get a lot of the benefit of the data that we generate. You're going to see this in all kinds of things. As I indicated, you'll see it in terms of behavioral analytics online, which is part of one of your commandments for cybersecurity. You're going to see it, I think, at the airport. You're going to see it at the border. You're going to see it at your bank. All of this is about helping to protect people in a smart way rather than a clumsy way. And now, I understand that Elon Musk and a bunch of other people think that at the end of this, Arnold Schwarzenegger is going to come back as the Terminator, and but I'm not so worried about that. I do think, however, it's important that as we deploy this artificial intelligence, we don't use it as a substitute for human judgment. We use it as an enhancer for human judgment. The final thing I want to talk a little bit about was, before I take some questions, is where I think the financial system is going with cybersecurity. You had a whole discussion about blockchain, but I want to stand back from that and ask a larger question. One of the debated issues that's come up in the last year or so has been whether the financial system could become a casualty of global warfare. And more and more, we have weaponized our banking system. We now use, and frankly, this is the US has the dominant position in global finance. We now use our position in finance, our dollar as a reserve currency, the SWIFT system, which we in the West operate, as a platform to impose sanctions and other kinds of penalties on bad actors. I'm not just talking about money laundering here or illicit trade. I'm also talking about nation states, and you see this with Russia and North Korea. Now, there's a lot of reasons why that's preferable to kinetic reaction, but you need to understand that when you start to put the financial system in play as a battle space, some people are going to say, okay, I'm using all my weapons. North Korea being exhibit A on that. because I think they've been involved for years now in using criminality, partly because they don't really participate in the system very much. And as we tighten the screws, we need to make sure we're not beginning to throw a lot of stones and we have a lot of glass in our financial house. Now, the good news is I do think the financial sector is among the most advanced, if not the most advanced, in incorporating cybersecurity in terms of its own operations. Although I'd caution you, it's easy to talk about the big global banks and look at them and say, wow, they're really, they really do quite a bit. You have to worry about the small and medium banks too, that don't have that capability, but are still part of the network. The banks of Bangladesh, which are around the world, which don't preserve or save their credentials, but could be a way to inject uncertainty and disruption into the financial system. As I said earlier, just in the way that the electoral system has now become a target for those who want to destabilize and undermine confidence in democracy, the financial system could become a target for those who want to undermine our faith in the global economy. So in many ways now, the really kind of cataclysmic attacks are not necessarily going to be huge things that blow up. They're going to be insidious undermining of faith in institutions that really has a ripple effect around the globe. So how do we deal with this? Well, I think obviously building security is part of it. Another piece of this that I'm involved in to some extent is an effort being done by a number of global institutions to start to come up with some laws of armed conflict or international laws relating to how you deal with cyber and what is off limits to attacks. And in particular, beginning to identify certain kinds of critical infrastructure that should not be subject to a cyber attack any more than you would drop a bomb on a hospital. It's a challenging process, partly because there's not global agreement on this, partly because there's a big problem with attribution. And if people think they can get away with sabotaging something, they're more likely to do it. And deterrence does, in fact, depend upon better and more accurate attribution. And then part of it is making sure that when you bring people together, they understand that there's a common benefit to preserving, let's say, the financial system against having its integrity undermined or its availability undermined that outweighs whatever transitory benefit they might get in a particular case by trying to disrupt the system. The example I use is a little bit like the sea. The sea is what we call a global commons. We only get the value of it if we all treat it respectfully and with mutual respect for each other's interest. Otherwise, the sea lanes close because we're all fighting each other. The internet is a global commons, and particularly as it relates to critical infrastructure and global systems, is a global commons. And so I guess what I'm saying when I'm calling to action is, all of you, this is not just about building better technologies and marketing them better. It's about getting engaged and involved in the public debate on all of these issues. Because if we screw up the global economy and our political system, no amount of technology is going to save us. And the ability to take your knowledge of what technology can do, but apply it in terms of these important public policy issues which affect all of us, I think makes an important contribution to our public discourse both here and around the world. So I've called you to a lot of action. My last call is, if you have questions, we've got a mic and we got about 7 minutes, so raise your hands. Yes?
So you alluded to the threshold. Okay. Yes, I'm Maynard Hawley from RAND Corporation. You alluded to the threshold of when nation states should consider kinetic response to a cyber intrusion or takedown. What is your feeling as to where that threshold is? Is a moving target? Compare the Sony hack versus taking down the air traffic control system. How would you respond?
I think it's a bit of a moving target, and for a lot of reasons. First of all, I think there's not a consensus view on this, although I think we can all agree there's some cases that everyone would agree with. There's a certain amount of benefit to strategic ambiguity, but ambiguity is not the same as irrationality or unpredictability. I know that President Trump likes to say, I'm going to be unpredictable. I would say you want to be ambiguous, but you don't want to appear to be crazy, because if people think you're crazy, then they might as well take a shot. Maybe you won't do something. I would say it's probably generally acknowledged if there was a serious loss of life because of a cyber attack, or serious economic damage. You take down the air traffic control system, you shut the lights out, and people die. Now I think you're getting into a place where you could get a kinetic reaction. And that's not to say we're going to drop an atomic bomb, but you could see not just an online response, but a response that actually disabled the server or cut something in a physical way. But this is one of the challenges. International law of armed conflict is complicated enough as it is when people wear uniforms and things happen in a physical battlefield. It's much harder when you're operating in a world in which the launch of the attack isn't going to come from a missile silo somewhere in North Korea. It's going to come from the Starbucks down the block because someone's got a thumb drive with malware. So this is very much a work in progress, but it is being thought about.
Thank you.
Yes, back there.
Mr. Secretary, I appreciate your call to engage in the public dialogue. And I know that a lot of what we've talked today about has been in the cyber and crypto realms. But I want to ask you another question that many boards of directors are dealing with in the Valley especially, which is one of culture. And the importance of culture, and whether that's gender discrimination or the First Amendment for their employees, and how that can impact a company's reputation moving forward.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to say something which I've said privately to some senior people in the tech area. For the last 10, 15, 20 years, being successful in the tech area in Silicon Valley was like a badge of honor. They were like American heroes, glamorized. You had Steve Jobs had a book written about him. Mark Zuckerberg had a movie, whether you liked it or not. The point is, there was a lot of glamour to it. And there's a lot of, we're going to do the right thing, we're good, we dress in T-shirts, and we play foosball, and that shows we're cool. I've actually thought for a while that the tech community could start to become about as popular as hedge fund managers. And that's partly because a lot of what's being done here is going to put people out of jobs. Now, that's inevitable. I mean, creative destruction is the theory behind capitalism. And I know it's a badge of honor in the Valley to say something is disruptive. I will tell you, when I was in school, if you were disruptive, you went to the principal. And I say that jokingly, but for the people who are being disrupted, it's not fun, and they get angry. Bankers were the poster child because we had 2008. But one of the things I have cautioned people about is you need to start thinking about the effect of what we are doing technologically on people who are going to be on the losing end of this. That's not to say you don't do it, but we've got to start owning that as part of our responsibility. I would then add to that these more recently controversial issues. Some of the culture of, particularly the way women have been treated, strikes me as a manifestation of the sense that we're good. We're doing good things. We're cool. Therefore, everything we do is cool and good. Therefore, we can't be criticized. And as I've indicated, I don't think that lasts very long. In fact, that ship may already have started to sail. So I think culture and responsibility is not only important in terms of your own enterprise and making sure people feel invested in it, but it's important for your customers and your stakeholders and your politicians. All of those people are going to be affected by this. And there's always a latency. It doesn't happen right away. And finally, on the issue of free speech. So as I said earlier, I think the fake news thing, I get it. And as I've said, I think there's some things you can do that are basically pretty agnostic from a content standpoint. But I get nervous when we start to take things down that we don't like. Now, I'll be honest, there are many free countries that ban certain kinds of political speech. In Germany and in France, for example, Holocaust denial is illegal, and you can go to jail for it, and they'll shut that stuff down. And I have sympathy for that, but having been raised as, in the American legal system, I get really nervous about the line drawing problem there. Now, there are clearly some lines you can't cross. You can't incite violence. You can't recruit people to commit acts of violence. I think there are things we can do to educate people and build kind of antibodies to this kind of hate. But I think the more and more companies here and platforms here try to take ownership of deciding what we're going to allow, what we're not going to allow, the more careful they need to be about having a principled, clear line that they can explain to their customers and their stakeholders. It can't just be, I personally disagree with this, but I don't with that. So it's about coming up with a principled approach and then being clear about it and being articulate about it. I think that is a big challenge, particularly for the media, the modern media that is operating in the tech world. So really great challenging issues. Probably the subject for another security series. Other questions? Well, let me then leave you with one final thought. I have not really said the word privacy very much here, but that's obviously a big discussion that happens all the time. And often the two are put in opposition to each other, but I think actually they're both two sides of the same coin. Privacy, which is a promise basically to honor your right to control your data, privacy is meaningless without security, because if you can't live up to the promise, you haven't given anybody any privacy because you don't have any security. At the same time, security without privacy, what's the point? If we have no privacy, we don't control our data, we have no control over our lives, then what are we securing ourselves against? So again, an important part of the debate has to be to recognize that we can make security and privacy really compatible. In fact, they're enablers of each other. But again, a lot of this is explaining to people in not just in technical terms, but in human terms, what's at stake, what we're trying to do, and how this affects them. And I love coming out here because I think this is a very exciting place. People are thinking about hard problems. They're coming up with creative ways to deal with those problems. It's important to remember we've got to communicate that to the rest of the world. People do benefit from this, but sometimes the benefits are not evenly distributed, and sometimes the benefits aren't recognized. And if we don't step up and make sure we're making the case for why this is good, and we're, frankly, ameliorating and mitigating the harm to those people who wind up on the brunt of the downside, if we don't do that, then you could find yourself in a really unhappy circumstance. So again, it's been a great conference to be here and great to be with all of you, and I'm going to turn it over to Jim.
It takes a community to build a community, and I want to close with an expression of gratitude. First off, for our sponsors and event partners, we really can't do this without you, so thank you very much. But also to the speakers and to each of you as attendees. I know some of you went out of your way to travel across the country to be here to speak. Some of you came from other countries. A huge commitment. The most important thing that we have is what? It's our family and it's our time. So you spent a full day with us. And I think a good day starts with the following, right? If you laughed, if you learned, you had a chance to look inward and upward, those are probably some components of a good day. So hopefully this was a good day, and we're really grateful. So thank you, and that's it.